Please respond to the reading of Psalm 23 by reading responsively and singing the refrain in your order of worship. I shall not want.
He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside still waters. Shepherd me, O God, beyond my wants, beyond my fears, from death into life.
He restores my soul. He leads me in right paths of righteousness for his name's sake.
Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I fear no evil, for thou art with me. Thy rod and thy staff, they comfort me. Shepherd me, O God, beyond my wants, beyond my fears, from death into life.
Thou preparest a table before me in the presence of my enemies. Thou anointest my head with oil. My cup overflows.
Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I shall dwell in the house of the Lord forever. Shepherd me, O God, beyond my wants, beyond my fears, from death into life.
This is the word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
I've read or heard Psalm 23 at many memorial services. Some people even refer to it as the funeral psalm, which speaks to its timeless words of comfort. It's the passage that I read most in hospitals and homes near the end of someone's earthly life. Its beauty and familiarity are like no other. In fact, it's one of those rare passages from the Bible that believers and non-believers can likely identify or at least say that they've heard or read before. I remember when I first memorized Psalm 23, it was my 9th grade English class. My teacher happened to be a Young Life sponsor. I don't know if this had something to do with it or not, but each student had to memorize a couple of poems and recite them in front of the class. And being at a public school, I don't know if he was pushing any boundaries back then by including Psalm 23 on the list of poems to choose from, but it's easy to identify and explain how this is a masterpiece of Hebrew poetry. Psalm 23 is also a sacred text because of the spiritual and emotional attachments that many people have with it. As a preacher, at times I pause and ask myself, what more could I possibly say? What needs to be said? The famous theologian and Bible commentator Walter Brueggemann began his commentary of Psalm 23 with, "It is almost pretentious to comment on this psalm." The last thing I want to do today is what several commentators have done, and that is to rob Psalm 23 of its specialness by overanalyzing it. I'm also completely validating why Psalm 23 is so often read at funerals and memorials. I mean, it was read at my dad's service. I'll likely choose it for mine as well one day. But what I want to do today is talk about why Psalm 23 is applicable at death and life. There are a number of different categories of psalms, and this one can be described as a psalm of trust. Now, like Jesus described the relationship between the sheep and the good shepherd, the sheep know the shepherd. They trust the shepherd. Their very life depends on the shepherd. Trust, especially in these psalms, was established through a few ways. Sometimes it's like Psalm 23 where the psalmist has already endured a crisis. Other psalms of trust occur in the midst of crisis or right before one. The point is that something so life-shaking, so life-threatening has happened or is about to happen that the psalmist knew that he or she could turn to no one else in the entire universe other than God. Rolf Jacobson writes, "But whether the crisis is past, present, or future, the crisis is not incidental to these psalms. Rather, it is the crisis that generates the words of trust. Thus, the genre teaches us that danger, evil, and crisis are a part of the life of faith. In and through crises, faith is tempered and trust matures." Our psalmist today experienced unrest, hostility, weariness, danger, and an array of perplexing problems. One of the beauties of Psalm 23 is that we're not given the exact threat. It's enough to give us a good idea, but general enough that believers have turned to these words in physical, emotional, financial, spiritual, even social crises. We encounter three major characteristics or works of God in Psalm 23 as identified by James Evans Jr. Those are provision, abundance, and restoration. And there is a poetic pattern that we'll walk through, not to make this some kind of academic exercise, but hopefully to enhance our adoration. Psalm 23 begins by affirming who God is and our relationship with him. The Lord is my shepherd. This statement might sound a bit bold. We claim God, but really we only do this after realizing the shepherd has claimed us first as one in his flock. And because our shepherd is God, he provides all we need. The Lord does provide during our earthly lives, so much so the psalmist says, "I shall not want." During this time and context, kings were referred to as the shepherds of their people, and they were responsible for providing food and protection so that their people could live securely. Right? These were the basics. One of our problems is that I bet if I asked each of you today if you wanted something, you could think of at least one thing. I mean, I really want Ferrari to win the Miami Grand Prix this afternoon. That might be a bit too obscure. So I really want the Mavs to beat the Suns this afternoon. Those are great examples of not properly separating wants and needs. Right? So the picture painted right off the top here is that God is the greatest king, capital K, of all. And because of who God is, a better translation might say, I shall lack nothing. Again, this isn't the prosperity gospel of unlimited riches and blessings, but everything that's needed to live securely. Verse 2 introduces us to the theme of abundance. While verse 2 emphasizes the shepherd's provision of food and water, the imagery paints a picture of a richer, again, not financially richer, but a deeper experience under God's care. Sheep and people need times of rest, hence the Sabbath. But the picture here is one of abundance, right? Lush pastures next to peaceful water. Yeah, that sounds pretty good, right? And then verse 3 articulates our third theme of restoration quite clearly. He restores my soul. How? This is where the beauty of poetry can be interpreted in different ways. It's hard not to recite the King James Version. I mean, that was part of our reading this morning. And I'm not here to argue which translation might be more accurate than others. Not the point. Both the King James and the NIV speak of being guided in paths of righteousness for his name's sake. And this speaks to God caring for our souls as much as he does our bodies. And I absolutely believe that to be true. The NRSV, though, reads right paths, which in staying in the relationship of a shepherd and sheep, you can see how this is correct as well. You can interpret this as God teaching us the difference between right and wrong, moral and immoral, just and unjust, and how his path is the right one. This also implies protection, right? Shepherds have to know the right paths for safety and provision. Thus, God restores us inside and out, and through us, God is working to restore and reconcile his world. I want to pause momentarily within our themes here to point out something notable in Hebrew poetry. One commentator put it this way: as is often the case, what is central structurally is also central theologically, right? We're in the middle of the psalm here. So in this case, the affirmation of the unfailing presence of God and God's protection for life, even in the midst of the most threatening of circumstances, right? This is the kernel of the psalm right here. We read the beginning of verse 4, even though, and realize whether we're facing death at the end of our earthly life or it's a big crisis before the end of our life, it does not compare or compete with God's desire to protect and preserve life in him. Again, we're familiar with the language of the valley of the shadow of death. But the NRSV here says the darkest valley, alluding to the guiding of the shepherd through perilous places. God's provision is shown through his rod and staff, two of the most important tools of the shepherd. Right, the staff was used to guide and even nudge or prod the sheep along in the right direction. The rod was a shorter stick, more like a club, to fight off predators. The rod also alludes to the symbol of a king's scepter, building on that image, right? That our divine king will do anything to save and protect us. But then the psalm takes a bit of a turn, though, in verse 5. God is no longer pictured or personified as a shepherd, but is now the welcoming host. And the abundance is everywhere. And that's magnified because it's done in the presence of enemies. And whatever crisis these enemies were causing, God's presence and provision were abundant. And lastly, in verse 6, the psalmist's soul is completely restored by finding a home in God. One more wordplay example for you. Right, we know that it says goodness and mercy will follow me. But to me that almost sounds a bit too passive, or like it's like the wake left behind me, which would be great. I would hope that our lives leave trails of goodness and mercy. Or maybe it kind of sounds like little pets or our own sheep following us as if we're the leader, right? Mary had a little lamb, and everywhere that Mary went, goodness and mercy were sure to go. The Hebrew suggests something a little different, though. It can be translated to say that surely goodness and mercy will pursue me all the days of my life. Big difference. God and his character are pursuing us. See, the psalmist is used to being pursued by enemies. Here, God is pursuing the psalmist for restorative purposes. Yes, again, this is a beautiful image for the end of one's life, but this is describing what every day can be like when we find a home with God, a home in God, as the psalmist did. We need shepherds, we need mentors, we need people we can be accountable to, because like sheep, we're prone to do really dumb things. We do not have all the answers. We need daily guidance. And Larry Libby told the following story. He says, Bob, my father-in-law, hunts deer every fall in the mountains of California. A number of farmers and ranchers in the area are willing to let individuals or small groups hunt on their property if the hunters ask permission and show respect for the land. Last year, my father-in-law asked if he might drive through a certain gate and do some hunting in the evening. And the rancher gave Bob a thoughtful look and said, I'll do my best California rancher voice. I don't know what that sounds like, but yeah, you can come on the land, but you'd better let me ride with you in the truck for a while. I want to show you some things. Bob could have argued, but he didn't. So the pair drove through the gate onto the ranch. They'd been skimming across a wide, seemingly featureless field when the rancher suddenly said, "You'd better slow down." Bob pulled his foot off the accelerator. There was no deer. As far as he could see, there were no creeks, gullies, or fences, just a wide pasture stretching out to the dusky foothills. "Park right here," the rancher said. "I want to show you something." And they got out of the truck and began walking. And the rancher put his hand on Bob's shoulder and he said, "Look up ahead." My father-in-law stopped dead in his tracks. Cleaving at right angles across their path and across the pasture as far as he could see in both directions was a yawning black tear in the surface of the earth. The crack was probably 30 feet across, and peering over the edge, the hair on Bob's neck bristled. The sheer, rock-ribbed sides of the great volcanic fissure plunged to unknown depths. Cold, still air seemed to exhale from the blackness below. Walking back to the truck, Bob marveled at how difficult it was to see the fissure from just yards away. He smiled. Having a guide wasn't such a bad thing. He had a new appreciation for a man who knew the terrain and where to park the truck. Through his birth, life, death, and resurrection, Jesus knows the terrain of our lives better than anyone. There are all kinds of hired hands out there in the world, but there is only one good shepherd pursuing us with his goodness and mercy. Learn his voice. Find comfort in his staff and rod. Trust in his provision, abundance, and restoration. And find your home in him today, not just your last day. It's in the name of the Father, the Son, and Holy Spirit. Amen.